Good morning, students. Recorded this screencast to go over with you Chapter 8 in Comer's textbooks, all about framing arguments. And the reason we're looking at argument now is because the second part of assignment number 4, your proposal for additional research, is a kind of argument. In that proposal, you are basically arguing that based on the research that has already been done, which you've just summarized in part 1 of assignment number 4, there is a need for, or there is room for, additional research to be carried out, and you are arguing or proposing that you are the person to carry it out because you have thought about the best way to do it. So that's why we're thinking about arguments right now. Of course, Comer, her chapter covers argument much more broadly than just this one assignment. And as she has with many of her chapters, she begins with some common myths. The first one she talks about, there's a common misconception that arguments are all about winning. I get in an argument because I want to prove that I am right. When we're talking about arguments in an academic context, it's a little bit more complicated. Sometimes when someone says that they are arguing for a certain point, they're really just following a particular line of inquiry to see where it leads. Arguments in an academic context are often about simply finding out what we don't know yet, trying to find out more about a subject, so we are advancing knowledge and just making general progress. Another myth is that arguments only involve those highly debated issues that we're never supposed to talk about with family, especially at Thanksgiving. So I've put a couple there on the PowerPoint. The truth is that argument can sometimes be about a very mundane topic, even if we're talking about academic or scholarly arguments. My favorite example of this is from Comer's textbook, where she outlines she describes some research that has been done proving that if you stub your toe and swear out loud, that actually increases your pain tolerance. Somebody made that hypothesis, they carried out an experiment, and then they were able to argue in an article that swearing increases pain tolerance. Another myth is that arguments boil down to matters of black and white, either a pro or a con position, either for an issue or against it. It's actually much better to think about a topic, to think about an issue as involving a spectrum of possible positions. It's also a myth that arguments are based on opinion. You may have an opinion about the topic you've been researching, but if you want to come across as a credible researcher, your argument needs to be based in fact. Comer also describes the purposes of argument, like what is it that people are trying to accomplish with a particular argument. There are lots of things people might try to do. It's not so much about proving that the arguer is right, as much as it is perhaps trying to get others to think or act differently. How many times have you lost an argument, but then gone right on living and acting and thinking in exactly the same ways? Genuine academic arguments are meant to change the world, or at least make us think differently about some aspect of the world. You see the others on these bulleted lists here. If you want more details, take a look at Comer. She has a lot more to say about how sometimes arguments don't settle matters, but they actually raise more questions. I think the most effective part of this chapter is her section on criteria for effective argument. As you think about section 2 of assignment 4, this is a section to pay close attention to. Effective arguments are complex. The research you propose should not be simple or reductive. For your result to matter, you're really going to have to think about what kind of variables you're going to involve, how much time it's going to take, lots of things to consider regardless of your topic. So here's an example of an argument that is not complex. If we don't do something about climate change, people will suffer. I'm not saying that's not true. It's definitely true. especially poor folks and people of color across the world, are going to suffer if we don't do something about climate change. But that's a little bit too simple. A way to make it more complex would be to argue that though many or all of us feel strongly about climate change, or at least admit that it's a problem, people generally don't act because they feel powerless or are crippled by personal guilt. So that's a little bit more complex of an argument about the same issue as the first one. And as you think about arguments in the context of higher education and the professional world, you want to avoid those overly simplistic, reductive arguments. Arguments have got to be genuinely debatable, and that's what's meant by the word contestable. There have to be at least two sides. Somebody would actually have to be willing to take the converse of your position. So I'm pretty sure no reasonable person would argue against the idea that the hungry should be fed. There's not really two robust sides to that issue. To make an argument about the same topic contestable, take a look at this. We shouldn't spend $1 on national defense until we've addressed the problem of food deserts. I think some people might feel like that is a good argument. Some people would probably argue pretty ferociously against it. And so you know that it is contestable. It has two sides. Another criterion is that effective argument is evidence-based. A myth was that argument is based on opinion, so here we see the other side of the same coin. Effective arguments depend on evidence. A couple of exclamation points here, because I think this is really important to always keep in mind. If you're making an argument, you have to prove it. Saying something does not make it so. I find myself writing that in the margins of literary analysis arguments quite often. If you think about this, if you think about a math course, maybe you had a teacher or a professor who always made you show your work. It didn't matter if you got to the right answer if you couldn't show how you arrived at it. You can think about argument in the same way. If you do not show the evidence that supports your argument, it does not matter if your argument is correct. You've got to be supported. Effective arguments are persuasive, and one of the ways that they persuade people is to appeal to all of those different is to use all three rhetorical appeals. So you can be persuasive by building your own credibility, showing that you've done research and written a careful proposal for further research. Some academics may try to use pathos as well to persuade. We try to convince people that a problem is a moral issue, that there's suffering involved, there's injustice in the world. All these things make us feel something emotionally, and that can be a way to persuade. And then rationally, many of us are swayed by convincing statistics or data. So the rhetorical appeals from English 111 are certainly relevant here as we talk about argument. Finally, one last criteria for effective argument is that an effective argument is timely. It is aware of its own historical moment. So I may have mentioned this before, but it would have been a bad idea for a politician in 2009 to argue that we needed to raise the tax on fossil fuels. Well, it was a time of great national suffering, comparable to what we're going through right now with the pandemic, where some people are unable to work and debt is piling up. But we're also seeing gas prices at $1.49 a gallon, which is as cheap as I've seen it in the last decade. So maybe it is a better time now to think about that kind of tax. If you wanted to make that argument, now might be a better time than 12 years ago. There are more criteria for effective arguments. So they're also qualified. They pay attention to nuances. So be aware of words like always, in every case, or 100% of the time. If you find yourself using that language, you want to dial it back. It's rarely true that there are no exceptions to an argument that you're making. So lean into that. Acknowledge that there are exceptions, that there may be cases where your argument would not be true. So these are words that help us hedge a little bit. Mostly, often, usually, in this case, for this discipline, or given this methodology. All of these things allow academics to be very precise in the kinds of arguments that they're making, not broad, sweeping generalizations. I think you've gotten a sense of this. This is one of the things that we've been hitting for the entire semester. Effective argument does not take place in a vacuum. Effective argument builds on what's been done before or contradicts some point that now seems incorrect. That is why for assignment number 4, you have to begin with that literature review essay. You summarize what's already known and what's been done before you make an argument about what should be done next. Effective arguments are also significant. They matter. Now, to do research and to prove, or at least to be able to suggest that swearing increases pain tolerance may not seem incredibly significant, but maybe somebody would think that it was. But in general, you want to think about significance when you're talking about arguments. Ask yourself what I like to call the so what question. When you get to the end of any kind of argumentative paper, ask yourself, so what? And see if what you have written provides an answer for that question. Essentially, you're trying to ascertain, trying to figure out why people should care about your argument. And you need to make that clear for them. You need to indicate why it should matter to them. Okay, I'll pick up with logical fallacies in a different screencast file.